I never thought I'd be the kind of man to declare war on an entire HOA, but here we are. I stood at the edge of my land, staring at the barren crater where my natural spring used to be. My water, my lifeblood, my legacy, was gone. And all because of some petty bureaucrats who decided that my spring was a flood risk. They drained it, stole it, turned my thriving piece of land into a dry, cracked waste, and they thought I'd just sit back and accept it. What they didn't know, what they never imagined, was that I wasn't the type to forgive. I was the type to strike back, and when I was done, their perfect suburban paradise would be drowning. Drop your city below. We want to see how far this story has reached. 2 months ago, I stood in our sunlit backyard, the gentle murmur of Emerald Well reassuring me that life still made sense. The spring had been my grandfather's gift to our family, a clear ribbon of water winding among mossy stones and willows 40 feet tall. I could close my eyes and still hear his laughter echo off those stones as he taught me to skip rocks at age 5, and later to listen for the movement of water in the earth. It was not just water, but our history, and I took a step back in horror the afternoon my wife Sarah dropped the official HOA notice onto our kitchen table. She slammed it down with shaking fingers. They demanded the immediate removal of all standing water on penalty of a $500 per day fine. My heart pounded when I read the words flood hazard, risk to property values, immediate compliance required. Flood hazard? I thought. The spring had never flooded anything, not in 100 years. Sarah's voice cracked when she reminded me that no child had ever been endangered by this calm, bubbling pool. We were supposed to be safe here. When I arrived at the emergency HOA meeting 2 nights later, I carried snapshots of every season. Winter's icy crust, spring's riot of wildflowers, summer's cool refuge, autumn's leaf drift patterns, alongside a petition signed by neighbors who cherished the spring's wildlife. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee and anticipation. At the head of the folding table dais sat Karen Reed, our HOA president, hair perfect, nails gleaming, seated like a monarch. She passed around a thick, glossy report she refused to let me read, insisting it contained confidential geological findings that proved Emerald Well threatened our foundations and could unleash catastrophic flooding, millions in damage. I stood and asked when the surveyors had been here, how they had measured the spring at full moon or midday rain, who had done the math, and she only smiled and said the report was sealed to protect the experts from harassment. My pulse hammered. A retired lawyer from down the street rapped his cane on the floor and reminded her that every homeowner had a right to review any claims made about their property. But Karen pressed on, motioned for a vote, and 7 hands shot up, board members and their closest friends, with Martha, my once friendly next-door neighbor, among them. After the meeting emptied, I spotted Martha alone by the snack table, shifting on her feet. "Martha, you used to bring your grandkids to feed the ducks here," I said, voice unsteady. "Why did you vote yes to drain my spring?" Her eyes flicked around the empty hall before she whispered that Karen had promised to greenlight her home addition, an extra bedroom she'd been pleading for ever since her daughter announced summer visits. She said she would approve it immediately if I supported removing the spring, Martha admitted, cheeks wet with unshed tears. My breath caught. She had traded the very heart of my family's land for a drywall permit. I felt a cold fury rise in my chest. All along, this fight had been less about safety and more about squeezing me out, dropping my property value so a developer friend could swoop in and buy at a bargain. That was the moment everything crystallized. The spike of betrayal wasn't just Karen's decree or the bulldozers she planned to send. It was realizing that someone I had trusted, someone who once borrowed cups of sugar and shared summer barbecues, had voted to destroy my grandfather's legacy in exchange for personal favors. I could taste rosewater tears still lingering on Martha's cheeks as I vowed to expose every corrupt corner of this HOA. I would gather proof of Karen's secret alliances, unearth the surveys from her brother-in-law's suspended license firm, crowdsource memories of neighbors who had drunk from that spring in drought years, and shine a light so bright that their Cover-ups would shrivel in its heat. I hadn't expected the battle over Emerald Well to go digital, but by dawn on day 5, my phone was buzzing with messages from neighbors who had seen my petition pop up on the community Facebook page. I'd spent the previous evening assembling every scrap of evidence I could find. A scanned copy of the HOA's secret geological report, proof that the surveyor was Karen's own brother-in-law, whose license had been suspended for falsifying safety, studies, and a century's worth of family photographs showing my grandfather teaching neighborhood kids to fish at the spring. I posted it all under the headline, "You won't believe what our HOA is hiding," and within minutes the floodgates opened. Early that morning I ran into Tom, who lives 3 doors down. He admitted he'd voted with the board because he thought I was exaggerating. By lunchtime he'd changed his mind, confessed he'd tested his basement sump pump the night before, and found water pooling faster than usual. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, who moved to Cascade Heights in 1974, typed out a single line that lit the thread on fire. That spring saved us in the drought of '78 when the city water pumps failed and everyone hauled jugs back to their houses. Her words carried more weight than any legal brief. Late that night, around 2:30, I bolted upright to the sound of diesel engines rumbling just beyond my fence. Peering through the curtains, I saw 2 white trucks parked beside a trench where the spring's bubbling channel used to flow. I grabbed my flashlight and ran barefoot across the grass, heart pounding. Under the glow of work lights, I found Marcus, the HOA maintenance manager, supervising a half-dozen men hooking up industrial pumps to giant hoses that slurped the remaining water from the creek bed. He glanced up, eyes uneasy, and stalked forward to insist they had board authorization to conduct an emergency safety inspection. I pointed at the snarling metal jaws of the pump. Nobody gave permission for midnight drainage. He swallowed hard and insisted that the judge's order was real and immediate, that he'd texted it to every homeowner. Clutching my phone, I demanded to see the document. Marcus's hand shook as he waved a blurry photo on his phone. It turned out to be a fax cover sheet, illegible, with a forged signature. Behind him I heard shouts as the machines roared to life, mud spurting from hoses into the gutter. I raced back inside to gather my evidence and call the county clerk, only to discover that the court file had no entry matching the case number on Marcus's picture. My stomach dropped. Someone at the courthouse must have been paid off or bullied into doctoring records. I scrambled to find the real judge's chamber phone number, aware that every passing minute drained gallons more water from the spring and from our collective peace of mind. By the time I rang the judge's clerk, 20 neighbors had tagged me in frantic messages reporting that their yards were turning into swamps, that puddles collected so fast they could hear water sloshing against their foundation boards. A frantic voice on my phone explained that the judge had never signed any emergency order. He was out of town and wouldn't return for another week. Flat-footed, I realized Karen's team had forged not only the survey, but now a court order too. My pulse pounded so hard I could taste blood at the back of my throat. In that moment, I felt the full weight of the conspiracy. They were willing to break laws, falsify documents, even risk everyone's homes to get rid of my spring. Suddenly, I understood the real reason for their rush. Once the water was gone, they could claim I had created a safety hazard and fine me into bankruptcy before dragging my property into a bargain sale. I called Sarah, breathless, and barked that I needed her to drive straight to the county clerk's office to demand a printout of every emergency order filed in the last month. As she raced off in her car, I pulled on boots and headed back into the night, determined to stop those pumps with my own 2 hands if I had to. The pumps were roaring so loud I had to shout to be heard. I waded into the muddy trench, ice-cold water seeping through my socks. My fingers scrabbled at hoses and valves. When one of the crew shouted that they'd called the sheriff to remove me, I slapped the valve wheel shut, twisted it half a turn, and felt the engine shudder to silence. Muddy water pooled around me, reflecting the stark beam of my flashlight as men froze mid-stride. The machine stilled, the hoses thumped softly against the dirt, and in the sudden hush, I saw wider faces of shock and fear. They knew I'd just stopped the entire operation single-handedly. Behind me, the willows rustled as if cheering. I stood there dripping mud, chest heaving, realizing that it wasn't just my water I was fighting for. It was everyone's right to stand up to a rigged system. In the aftermath, the crews filed off like beaten dogs, and I sent Karen one final text. "Show me your emergency order or I'll see you in court at first light." Then I trudged home, soaked and triumphant, convinced more than ever that people who try to control nature without respect will always be undone by its force, and by those who refuse to let it be stolen. By sunrise, the entire street smelled of damp earth and tension. After last night's midnight sabotage, I woke to texts from neighbors whose yards had turned into mini-lakes overnight. The Johnsons' wading pool was now a real one, and Mr. Patel's rose bushes looked waterlogged beyond salvation. My own lawn sloshed underfoot as I slipped into boots and sprinted across to Ellen's porch. She told me through chattering teeth that the HOA had sent a certified letter threatening trespass charges if I set foot on any controlled drain sites. Armed with printouts and legal citations, I convened an impromptu town hall in my front yard. Over 30 neighbors squeezed past muddy tire tracks to hear me explain how they'd been deceived. I laid the evidence on a folding table, copies of the fraudulent order, the surveyor's suspension notice, before and after photos of the spring. Voices rose as Aunt Lorraine remembered teaching my grandfather to fish, and young Marco shook his head, furious that his brand-new playset was afloat. When Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat and declared she'd stand by me until the water runs dry, we all cheered. But the real moment came that afternoon, when I slipped away to the HOA office under the guise of delivering updated documentation. The receptionist barely looked up as I handed her a stack of papers stamped with official seals. Once inside, I let myself into the unlocked back room and found the file cabinet labeled Emergencies. Heart pounding, I rifled through folders until I discovered the master copy of the so-called geological survey, and beneath it, a sheaf of emails. Between Karen and her brother-in-law laying out the plan to drain my spring, collapse property values, then profit from emergency repairs. At that moment, I heard footsteps. I yanked open the top drawer, clutching the files, and dove behind the desk just as Marcus strode in, clipboard in hand, muttering about water safety protocols. He paused at the open drawer, brow furrowed, then muttered that he'd left the pumps running down the block, covering his tracks. I held my breath as he snapped photos of empty folders with his phone. Then, as he turned to leave, I realized my only chance. I lunged from behind the desk, grabbed his clipboard, and, before he could react, slammed the drawer shut and sprinted for the door, files under my arm. Marcus yelled behind me, but I burst into daylight and didn't stop running until I reached my car. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as I flung the glove box open, shoved the documents inside, and collapsed into the driver's seat. My phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. "Did you get it?" I gasped, yes, and she whispered relief, urging me to lock the files in my safe and get to the community center before nightfall. That evening, in the crowded gymnasium, I held those emails and survey pages overhead and recited Karen's plan. The flicker of phone flashlights lit up faces filled with betrayal. Mrs. Henderson stood to say she'd never sign another HOA petition without reading the fine print. Tom from 3 doors down admitted he regretted his vote and vowed to help remove Karen from her post. A dozen voices called for a special election. At the back, I spotted Karen slipping in, flanked by 2 security guards who looked more surprised than menacing. She tried to smooth her hair and smile, but her eyes darted to the photocopied evidence in my hand. "You're spreading lies," she insisted, voice trembling. A neighbor shouted that lies were fine compared to flooded basements. When she demanded proof of those emails' authenticity, I pointed to her brother-in-law sitting in the second row, white as a sheet, and announced I had his own admission scrawled on his company letterhead. Karen's veneer shattered, her guards exchanged uneasy glances, and the entire room surged forward, chanting, "Vote her out!" I stepped back, letting the crowd's outrage carry me as residents passed around handwritten ballots for the recall election. By the time I slipped out into the cool night air, the gym was buzzing. Tomorrow the HOA board would be empty, and Karen would have nowhere left to hide. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had the look of a war zone. Soggy driveways, sodden flower beds, and the distant drone of sump pumps battling a losing fight. I climbed into my mud-splattered truck and drove to the Johnsons' house 6 doors down, where I'd heard their basement was ankle-deep in brown water. Mrs. Johnson met me at the door, eyes red from crying. She clutched her soaked quilt and whispered that her daughter's childhood photos were floating in the black swirl below. In that moment, realizing this was no isolated prank but a calamity triggered by Karen's greed, I felt anger like a live wire. I knelt beside her and placed a hand on her trembling shoulder, promising I would make it right. But even as I spoke, I knew words alone weren't enough. I snapped a few photos of the flooded staircase and vaulted into action, calling my friend Luis, a volunteer firefighter, who arrived within 20 minutes with a portable pump. As we slogged through mushy carpet and upended furniture, I explained how the spring had acted as a natural relief valve for underground pressure, until it was capped. Luis shook his head and muttered that he'd never seen so many basements in crisis at once. Back at home, I spread blueprints and geologic surveys across my kitchen table. Sarah hovered nearby, scribbling notes as I dialed the county engineer's office. The receptionist, sympathetic but bound by procedure, directed me to file an official incident report before any inspection could occur. As I drafted her a written statement detailing how the HOA's emergency order had usurped my riparian rights and unleashed this disaster, my phone pinged with a text from Marcus. "You need to remove that website or we'll see you in court," it read. Seeing his message, I felt the old fear twinge, but the Johnsons' ruined keepsakes steeled my resolve. Determined to give my neighbors a voice, I set up folding chairs on my front lawn and invited everyone to share their stories. One by one they came, Mr. Patel, whose koi pond had become a mosquito nursery. The Wilson twins, who could no longer host their therapy dog sessions because of mold. Even Martha, who admitted that the roses she'd once planted in support of Karen were now wilting in the same saturated soil. Their outrage crackled through the gathering like electricity. When Mrs. Henderson, having lived here since before the houses were built, stood up and recounted how her well had run dry during last month's drought until she tapped into my spring, a hush fell. She reminded everyone that water had always been a gift here, not something to be weaponized. Just then, a sleek black SUV rolled onto our street. Out stepped 2 suited lawyers flanking Karen herself, looking more like invaders than residents. She approached the crowd with a clipboard, cleared her throat, and insisted she was there to conduct a safety audit. But her eyes darted from one scorched lawn to the next, panic barely concealed. Before she could speak again, I stepped forward, holding aloft the forged emergency order I'd uncovered. I laid it flat on a folding chair and declared that this document was a fraud, a week older than any recorded flooding, bearing a judge's signature stolen from an unrelated case. I watched her lips part, then clamp shut, and for a second I thought she might run. But instead she squared her shoulders and snarled that I was defaming her name and would pay for this slander. An eruption of voices drowned her out. Neighbors demanded to see permits, questioned who had signed off on those pumps, and one by one they began chanting for her resignation. The point when the community's fury crystallized into action. The lawyers exchanged nervous glances, and Karen, no longer shielded by her board's simulacrum of power, stuttered that she had the neighborhood's best interests at heart. At that, Mr. Peterson, the retired lawyer who'd sat quietly at the back all week, rose to his full height and announced he was filing suit against the HOA, its president, and the drainage company for willful destruction of property and endangering public health. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted that the county health department would be next. Another resident threw up her hands, exclaiming that their skyrocketing insurance deductibles would bankrupt them all. In the swirl of anger and fear, I felt both exhilaration and dread. We were finally fighting back, but the legal war now loomed larger than any flooded basement. Karen turned and fled to her SUV, her lawyers hustling after her as the engine revved and the taillights winked out. Silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then the neighbors, so long divided by manicured fences and polite nods, turned back to me. Their faces were a mix of relief, resolve, and something like hope. I gathered the crowd, promising to coordinate our legal claims, to share every piece of evidence, and to keep fighting until our homes were dry and our voices heard. As twilight settled over Cascade Heights, I stood on my porch watching lanterns glow in soggy yards. In the distance, water still lapped angrily at doorsteps, but for the first time we weren't standing alone. The real battle was only beginning, and this time we would make sure justice flowed where it belonged. Just as Karen raised her voice to dismiss the flooding as isolated incidents, the earth shuddered beneath us. A deafening crack split the air, and a geyser of muddy brown water exploded through the sidewalk, launching chunks of asphalt like deadly shrapnel. The tremor rolled through the street, rattling windows and sending cars skidding off the road. Neighbors screamed as water jets carved new channels through lawns, carrying fence pickets and shattered concrete. Mrs. Henderson's prize rose bushes vanished in an instant, replaced by a churning whirlpool. Karen's tailored suit was drenched in sludge as she backed toward her SUV, pale and trembling. Marcus, the maintenance manager who'd supervised the spring's drainage, staggered forward, arms outstretched, powerless against the torrent. I raised my phone, capturing every moment live, shouting that nature's perfect revenge had arrived. The camera shook as the geyser surged higher, hurling debris skyward like fragmented missiles. Then the feed evaporated into